Usually, gender equality, sexes discriminated upon would like equality with respect to the things and opportunities that they like. There is even no data that says women want that. There is even no data that says women want to be equal and at par with men with respect to being required to undergo ROTC. That may be the justification, Mr. President, when you say you're including women, but have you heard from the women themselves if they indeed want that or not?
May daughters, Mr. President. Tinanong ko sila, gusto nila. May staff ng mga babae, gusto
Alam
nila.
namang sabihin sa'yo, hindi, author ka.
Ay, hindi.
Senator Francis Escudero is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Will the distinguished chairman, Mr. President, the Honorable Senator Bato, yield to a few questions?
Yes, Mr. President. Thank you.
Mr. President, allow me to discuss first some policy considerations and principles behind the filing and, if at all, approval of this bill before I go into the details of the proposed bill. With your permission, Mr. President, Your Honor. May I ask, Mr. President, what is the main intention behind repealing the NSTP law and reimposing mandatory ROTC service for first and second year college students as proposed in the measure? What is the main reason, Mr. President?
The main reason, Mr. President, is that if I may borrow the words from the CHED, they said that the NSTP law is failing us. It fails to it is not producing the needed reserve force of the armed forces of the Philippines, and it fails to achieve its envisioned goal, which is to organize a national reserve corps that can be mobilized in times of disaster and calamities, Mr. President.
Mr. President, may I ask if this is contained in a formal CHED position paper, if there is a study backing that position stated by CHED that NSTP has failed, or it was merely stated during the subcommittee hearing?
They have provided documents, Mr. President. In fact, according to CHED, after the imposition of the NSTP law, there were already 6 million graduates of NSTP that were given serial numbers. But for all intents and purposes, Mr. President, they were never used or mobilized either nationally or locally during disaster and calamity response. So it is really a total disaster, the NSTP program. That's according to CHED.
Mr. President, is that the fault of the NSTP graduates, the program, or the administrators and bureaucrats who failed to utilize them?
Well, for one, Mr. President, pwede natin ibalik yung fault sa gobyerno because of the organization of this NSTP graduates, or we call them the National Service Corps, is very much disorganized, Mr. President. Supposed to be the government that will take charge of this is the OCD, Office of Civil Defense. But for some reasons, including local political reasons, hindi po ito na-implement ang gusto at wala talaga. Unlike the graduates of ROTC, at any given time, they have standing ready reserve units that can be mobilized locally for any emergency, Mr. President.
Mr. President, Your Honor, I am a product of RA 7077 and also a product of the original National Defense Act, having taken both CAT in fourth year high school and CMT in my first and second year in college at the University of the Philippines. Up to today, Mr. President, Your Honor, I have not been called either. I have not been used, I have not been enlisted, my services have not been asked for any purpose. If by your definition that is the reason why you say NSTP is a failure, then wasn't ROTC a failure as well? If you look back, if that was in 1985, sino bang magaling sa math dito? Mga 15 plus 23, edi magka-40 anyos na yata yun. Na failure ang ROTC insofar as I am concerned, and I'm a living witness of that. Not to mention wasting all of my Saturdays under the sun and not learning anything. But I will go to that later. We're still here. So if it is a failure because nobody enlisted, nobody utilized them, nobody called upon them, the same is true with graduates of the ROTC under RA 7077 and even under the National Defense Act. Sa katunayan, I went through my ROTC. Kung maalala ko, nagpunta kami ng Fort Bonifacio, pinaputo kami ng 6 na rounds ng Armalite. And that's supposed to train me to defend my country? We were taught to march. We were taught to stand. We were taught to carry yung mga garan at that time. I didn't feel like I was equipped enough to defend my country because of those 2 years, once a week, every Saturday. So again, Mr. President, Your Honor, can the gentleman kindly, Mr. President, Your Honor, furnish me with a copy of a study, not merely the position of CHED, but a study upon which they are basing their statement that NSTP actually failed, because I have yet to actually see a study that says and evaluated and researched and reviewed NSTP that it is a failure based on the ground that nobody has been called upon actually using the NSTP program. And for the record, Mr. President, I'd like to state that the representative of CHED who attended the hearings is actually a graduate of the UP Vanguard. So biases aside, he would always be in favor of this. He would always be in favor of reinstituting the ROTC, having personal beliefs on this matter. So I ask that this representation, Mr. President, be furnished with a copy of a study, if one is at all available. Is there a study, may I ask? You have representatives from the AFP. Is there a study? Was a study ever conducted? Was a review ever conducted with respect to the inability, failure, or complete lack of substance and or effect of the NSTP?
Just based on records that we have, Mr. President, I am not, I am the sponsor of this mission. So I am really for the reimposition of ROTC. But browsing the records, Mr. President, napakalaki po ang number ng graduates ng NSTP na talagang hindi nagagamit. Unlike the ROTC, I beg to disagree that you also say that Mr. President, that the failure ng ROTC, maybe you were not a member of the ready reserve units of ROTC. That's why you were not mobilized during local calamities and disaster, Mr. President. Unlike my experience, if we want to share our own experiences, ako, yung buhay ko ay malaki pong naidulot sa ROTC sa buhay ko when it comes to discipline. At sa aking overall personality, Mr. President, kung mahinang klaseng tawa ko ngayon, maybe that's because of ROTC. Basta I attribute to my whole being, to my ROTC training before I entered the Philippine Military Academy.
Understood, Mr. President. Your Honor, we have various and varied experiences. That's why I'm asking for a study with respect to number one, the success or if at all failure of ROTC before NSTP, and a study, a review, findings based on evidence and fact that NSTP was indeed a failure. Because if I remember correctly, Mr. President, Your Honor, no study came out saying that NSTP is a failure. It was merely a statement of former President Duterte and a statement now of President Marcos and a statement of Vice President Sara Duterte that they want ROTC imposed to inculcate patriotism, nationalism, love for country, etc., etc. But I have yet to see a study based on facts and evidence that indeed it is a failure and indeed ROTC is better. Because you have to remember, Mr. President, Your Honor, ROTC is still a part of NSTP. So if even the ROTC graduates were not called upon under NSTP, then ROTC is not the solution to replace NSTP, but perhaps the problem lies somewhere else, not in the program itself. Which leads me to my next question, Mr. President, Your Honor. Under NSTP, you can choose to go through ROTC in compliance with the NSTP law. Would that be correct, Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. President.
And according to the data I read, about 20% of those qualified or required to undergo NSTP actually took ROTC. So
Yes,
may I ask, since the enactment of the NSTP law in 2006, natawag ba yung mga ROTC na yun? Nagamit ba sila sa national defense, law enforcement, at saka sa disaster response? Because 20% of NSTP, Mr. President, Your Honor, undertook or took ROTC.
They were mobilized locally, Mr. President, lalong-lalo na yung mga membro ng Ready Reserve battalions, Ready Reserve units of the ROTC. Every time may emergency, sila po ang frontliner ng Armed Forces of the Philippines aside from the regular units who responded to disasters and calamities. Sila po ay ginagamit, Mr. President. And I presume that they are products of the NSTP.
May we request, Mr. President, Your Honor, from the AFP, I presume, or the DND, data to the effect that indeed those who went through ROTC under the NSTP program were utilized, as stated by the good sponsor, in every locality of the country whenever there would be disasters.
Yes, Mr. President, I will, this representation will give you those documents.
Thank you, Mr. President, Your Honor. Now, Mr. President, I have no doubt that those who are prepared to lay down their lives for the country, hindi lang ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo, pati ang pumatay ng dahil sa'yo, nag-uumapaw ang pagmamahal sa bayan. Di ba? Kasi hindi naman tayo dapat mamatay lang. Di ba? Handa rin tayo para pagtanggol ng kalayaan dahil sa pagmamahal sa bayan. But while I do not diminish it, Mr. President, you know, in fact, I have high regard for it. Why does it seem like those who are not willing to take up arms are looked down upon as persons who do not love their country? Even our national hero did not raise a single sword or a single gun to defend his country and fight for his love for country. And yet, he is our national hero. By saying that patriotism and nationalism can only be achieved and taught through ROTC, is like saying that if you refuse to do so, then you most likely love your country less at the very least. What would the good sponsor say to that assertion?
Mr. President, our national hero, Dr. Jose Rizal, did not take up arms against the Spaniards, but he was killed by the Spaniard. So ultimately, he offered the ultimate sacrifice for this country. Hindi naman natin I disagree with the saying that the people who doesn't support ROTC are unpatriotic. No, it doesn't follow all the time, Mr. President. Ang sa akin lang, if you are going to have an order or classification, siguro, masasabi ko, Mr. President, yung Pilipino na willing pumatay ng mga invaders at magpakamatay in the name of the Filipino flag and if the Filipino people and the Filipino nation, they are more patriotic than those sitting on the sides, waiting for what will happen, and will just benefit the fruits that the fruits that we harvest after the war or after the invasion, Mr. President. But it doesn't say that I don't say that they are not patriotic. Maybe in degree, the differ, Mr. President. Para sa akin, mas patriotic yung taong willing pumatay at magpakamatay in the name of the Filipino flag, Mr. President.
Admittedly, and I don't disagree with the good sponsor, Mr. President, Your Honor. I asked that question because the basic declaration of policy when NSTP was passed is almost verbatim with the basic declaration of policy with respect to this new bill, reimposing ROTC as mandatory to inculcate patriotism, nationalism, love for country. Mention was also made with respect to disaster preparedness when the NSTP law was passed. The objective is actually the same. That's why NSTP included ROTC as one of the options, but not a mandatory imposition. By stating that ROTC is now going to be mandatory under the proposed bill, and by repealing expressly NSTP insofar as the other options are concerned, other than ROTC, it's like saying or conveying the message, Mr. President, Your Honor, that patriotism, nationalism, love for country, service for country can only be done through the ROTC program and not the other programs such as the literacy program, the community service program, by which they can show equally, with equal fervor, their love for country and patriotism.
Well, Mr. President, I subscribe that you can be patriotic while serving the CWTS or the Community Welfare Training Service or the Literacy Training Service. But Mr. President, remember, pagdating ng araw na tayo aatakihin ng China or whatever country atake sa atin, hindi po namimili ng babae o lalaki yung bala na paputukin ng kalaban. At pagdating po sa sakuna, disaster, at saka calamity, hindi po namimili ang calamity, ang baha, kung sinong mabubuhay o hindi, babae o lalaki ba. Kaya minabuti natin na lahat tayo ay disaster prepared, malalaki o mababae. At Mr. President, during the time yung old ROTC law was enacted, hindi pa po uso ang gender equality. Ngayon po, our women are always espousing for gender equality. So why not give them the opportunity to serve their country, to fight for this country if needed, Mr. President?
Actually, tutungo talaga ako sa puntong yan. Inunahan niyo lang ako ng konti. Nung nag-CMT ako, requirement at mandatory lamang ang CMT para sa mga lalaki. Ang layunin, ulitin ko, to inculcate patriotism, nationalism, love for country, etc., etc. Hindi ni-require yan sa mga babae. Ang dahilan ba ay mas maliit ang tingin ng gobyerno, ng kongreso, ng pamahalaan sa mga babae hindi kakayanin ng ROTC training? O ang tingin ba nila, hindi na kailangan mag-ROTC ng babae dahil mas mahal talaga nila kaysa lalaki ang bansa? Mas patriotic sila, mas nationalistic sila. What is the reason for the distinction at that time? Na bakit noon hindi sinasabay ang babae under the National Defense Act, under RA 7077, but now, there is a push to include them already. What is the difference and what changed, Mr. President, Your Honor?
Most likely, Mr. President, maybe I was not yet born when the Congress was debating that particular measure. But siguro na nangingibabaw yung pagmamahal ng Pilipino sa babae. Ay kung ako lang masunod, hindi ko pwedeng, I have a daughter, alam kong mahal na mahal ko yung anak ko, ayaw ko silang mahirapan. Pero, Mr. President, worst comes to worst. Ang pagmamahal ko sa aking anak ay kailangan ipakita ko sa paghahanda nila sa kanilang future na pwede silang lumaban kung kinakailangan para depensahan yung ating bansa, Mr. President, at sila mabubuhay kapag mayroong calamity. They can survive during calamity, Mr. President. Siguro ang rason, as I have said, hindi popular yung gender equality during that time. Right now, gender equality is the norm of the day. Yan palaging sinasabi ng ating mga kababaihan. So, let's give them the benefit of serving this country, Mr. President.
So ang sinasabi po niyo, noong mga panahong yon, mas mahal ng mga tatay at magulang yung mga anak nilang babae kaysa sa anak nilang lalaki?
Mas siguro, depende, the context is very, very different, Mr. President. We may be taking this issue out of context, but ngayon, mahal na mahal ko yung mga anak kong babae, but then again, I prodded them to become members of the reserve force of the Philippine Air Force because nakikita ko po yung sitwasyon na kapag tayo inatake dito, mga anak ko, walang alam kung paano depensahan yung sarili nila, much less our country. Kawawa tayo, Mr. President. So, ang pagmamahal ko sa kanila ay gusto kong ipakita na sigurado yung future nila. They can be safe. Kahit na wala na tayo dito sa mundong ibabaw, patay na tayo, they can stand their ground when it comes to invasion, Mr. President.
Personally, Mr. President, Your Honor, ayoko ng ROTC at hindi ako nasiyahan ng pinagdaanan ko yun. Pero, syempre, para mag-graduate, kailangan sumunod, kailangan sundin. Now, I believe gender equality is being used to offer this to women para yung pagkakataong meron ng lalaki, meron din ng babae. Yung po ang sinasabi niyo?
Well,
Gender equality ka mo, hindi lang lalaki yun. Dapat pantay na, gender equality eh. I-require din natin ng babae, hindi lang lalaki. That's the premise. Is that correct, Mr. President, Your Honor?
Yes, Mr. President, kasama na rin yan.
Hindi, yun ba yun? Hindi sa kasama yun. Sabi mo, gender, Mr. President, the sponsor said gender equality.
Yes.
What is made available to men should also be made available to women. That's what
Including,
gender equality is.
Your honors, including LGBTQ.
Yeah, women,
Everyone,
yeah, women.
everyone.
Yeah,
May,
women, all
may
of it.
pelikula nga, Private Benjamin, di ba? Ang galing ni Vice Ganda doon.
The point being, Mr. President, Your Honor, is usually gender equality, sexes discriminated upon would like equality with respect to the things and opportunities that they like. There is even no data that says women want that. There is even no data that says women want to be equal and at par with men with respect to being required to undergo ROTC. That may be the justification, Mr. President, when you say you're including women, but have you heard from the women themselves if they indeed want that or not?
May daughters, Mr. President. Tinanong ko sila, gusto nila. May staff ng mga babae, gusto
Alam
nila.
namang sabihin sa'yo, hindi, author ka.
Ay, hindi. I'm just being candid, Mr. President. I'm just being candid and honest to the good gentleman from Bicol that marami rin gustong talagang mag-ROTC. Kaya nga, kung gusto natin makuha talaga yung opinion nila, we have already received surveys saying that 90% of Filipinos want ROTC to be reinstated. So, that says, Mr. President.
Mr. President, Your Honor, can the good sponsor submit to this representation the data he is making mention of? Because the survey I read and saw asked men and women separately, but not by age group. Kasi ang binibigyan natin ng gender equality, yung 18 to 25 eh. Huwag natin pag-usapan yung
Maybe
mas
to help
matanda,
the
hindi
good
mas bata.
colleague from Sorsogon, I believe Senator Sherwin Gatchalian asked Pulse Asia, no? You had a writer question. Maybe you can share it to the body, the results of that survey. That would be very interesting to find out.
Yes, Mr. President, the sponsor would like to ask reinforcement coming from my good friend, the good gentleman from Valenzuela. No, not China. Valenzuela.
Valenzuela, Mr. President. Okay, flash. Well, Mr. President, I'll flash it on the screen, but we commissioned Pulse Asia to do a rider survey dated March 15 to 19, 2023. And the question, Mr. President, how much do you agree or disagree with the proposal to implement ROTC in all students in college, to all students in college? And the ones who responded agree is 78%, and the one who responded disagree is 13%, Mr. President. So there's an overwhelming support from our constituents.
13%?
13%, Mr. President. The ones who cannot say is 8%, Mr. President.
Could you share with us the demographics of that? That's what Senator Escudero is asking. How many were in the 18 to 21 bracket and the middle
25.
age and all that? It would be great to find
Yeah.
out.
For Mr. President, for those who are in the 18 to 24 years old, the ones who agree is 75%, Mr. President. For 25 to 34 is 83%, Mr. President.
Maybe get a copy of the survey.
Yes, Mr. President, I can furnish the body with a copy of the survey,
Yes,
Mr. President.
Maybe get a copy, Mr. President, after the interpellation.
I
Thank you.
believe the sponsor of the survey said he will share it with the body.
Yes, Mr. President. Now, aside from gender equality, Mr. President, Your Honor, what is the purpose why we're including women now when we never included them before?
Mr. President, as I've said a while ago, pag tayo inatake ng kalaban, hindi po namimili ang bala. Kung ang tatamaan lang niya lalaki. Kasama po ang mga babae, bata, matanda dyan, tatamaan. That is why, dapat rin prepared tayo lahat, pati babae. At pag tumama ang bagyo, baha, earthquake, hindi po namimili yan ng babae at lalaki. So dapat tayo lahat ay prepared sa lahat ng klaseng calamity. So yan po ang naging ang rason, Mr. President, bakit kailangan natin ihanda ang lahat ng mamayang Pilipino sa lahat ng klaseng sakuna na darating.
Mr. President, just for the record, instead of asking the good sponsor, the National Defense Act was enacted in 1935 when we were a newly founded republic. A few years after that, less than a decade, World War II started. But our forefathers did not see it fit at that time to include both men and women insofar as compulsory military or reserve military training is concerned. I believe we are farther from war today, given present world circumstances and politics, than we were in 1935, going into World War II. Bearing in mind too, Mr. President, Your Honor, that the beginnings of World War II were already starting by 1935 when we became an independent, when we became a Commonwealth, and World War I just finished, at least in Europe at that time. Moving forward, Mr. President, Your Honor, the proposed bill has highfalutin objectives with respect to patriotism, nationalism, love for country, disaster preparedness, as the distinguished sponsor said, and yet there is no program of instruction that is already in place, or at least, at the very least, if this will be delegated, there should be some guidelines and guideposts as to what such program of instruction would entail. For example, Mr. President, Your Honor, mahirap na nga punuin yung ROTC at requirements ng ROTC insofar as the military aspect of it is concerned, which I participated in when I was in college for 2 years, at least every Saturday. Dinagdag pa yung police, dinagdag pa yung disaster preparedness, dinagdag pa yung civic mindedness. So may I ask, this program of instruction, what would it entail? Hindi naman pwedeng sabihin lang natin na ito yung objective, tapos pag gumawa ng program of instruction ang CHED, ang TESDA, ang DND, in the author's mind, in the sponsor's mind, what would consist of such program of instruction? How many times a week? How do you break it up? At hindi na ba tulad ng dati na puro marcha? Kasi pag sinabi ROTC, marcha, ilalim ng araw, konting lecture lang, tapos may bivouac. Meron ka ng disaster preparedness. May law enforcement ka. Meron ka pang love of country. How does the distinguished sponsor see this being implemented under the POI being recommended and or mandated?
Mr. President,